The sale ring at the county fairgrounds smelled of cold sawdust and diesel that December morning, and the last lot the auctioneer wanted rid of was a string of 40 scrubby goats penned in the far corner, where nobody was standing. It was 1968 in the limestone hill country of the Missouri Ozarks, and the farm dispersal sale had been going since daylight. The good cows had sold first, then the pigs, then the tools and the wagon and the tractor with the cracked block, and the men in feed caps had drifted out toward their trucks with their hands in their coat pockets. What was left when the crowd thinned was the goats, hunched against the wire, breathing steam, hissing and stamping and climbing on one another, 40 ugly, unwanted, fence-jumping brush-eaters that the widow who had run the place could no longer keep. They were not much to look at. They were a mixed, hard-used string, part Spanish brush goat and part nothing anyone could name, rough-coated and rangy, some of them scarred across the nose from the wire, a few of the old nannies sway-backed and slab-sided. One big buck with a broken horn that swung his head at anybody who came near the rail. They were not the smooth, deep-bodied dairy goats out of a magazine. They were the kind of goat a hard-luck place ended up with, and the men leaning on the fence looked at them as a man looks at a chore. Ada Renfro was 58 years old that winter, and she had been a widow 4 years. She stood at the rail in her late husband's canvas coat with the cuffs turned back twice, and she watched the auctioneer try to move the goats and fail. He called them a nuisance lot. He said they would not graze a pasture like a proper cow and would not stay behind a fence like a decent animal, that they ate weeds and climbed the woodpile and jumped anything under 5 feet, and that a man would spend more on wire than he would ever get back in meat. He asked for $1 a head and got nothing. He asked for 50 cents a head and got a laugh from somebody near the gate. Then he asked for any offer at all on the whole lot just to clear the pen, and a man Ada knew. A man named Delbert Hooks, who farmed bottom ground down the valley, said out loud that you could not give the things away, and the crowd agreed with him by turning their backs and reaching for their keys. Ada raised her hand and bid $15 for the whole lot. The ring went quiet as a room does when a person has done something foolish in front of everybody. The auctioneer looked at her a moment as if to give her the chance to take it back, and when she did not, he knocked the goats down to her before anyone else could think it through, and Delbert Hooks said, loud enough to carry across the ring, that the widow Renfro had just paid good money for 40 mouths that ate brush and climbed trucks. A few of the men laughed. Most of them just shook their heads, which was worse, and went out to their trucks talking about it. By the time Ada had backed her stock trailer to the loading chute and coaxed the last of the 40 up the ramp with a bucket of cracked corn, the name had already gone ahead of her down the road. At the co-op that week, the men called her the Goat Woman, and they meant it as men mean a thing they have decided is a joke. They said she had bought herself a hillside of weeds on the hoof. They said she would be fencing until spring and feeding hay by Christmas and begging kids off on anybody who would take them by February. One of them figured out loud, for the benefit of the room, that $15 came to a little under 40 cents a goat, and that a man could not buy a sack of feed for what each one of those animals would eat before the winter was out. They laughed about the climbing. They laughed about the smell. Ada came in for salt and baling wire and let them talk, because there was no answer that would have landed, and because she had a reason nobody in that room knew about. The reason was a book. It was her mother's ledger, an oilcloth-covered farm book that had lived on the shelf by the kitchen window for as long as Ada could remember, its spine gone soft as cloth and its corners worn round, its pages penciled in a hand that had been in the ground 20 years. Her mother, Dosia, had kept the Hill place through droughts and hard winters that people still told stories about. And she had written down what worked and what did not, as other women wrote down recipes. There were entries in it going back before Ada was born. There was a page on how to keep sweet potatoes from rotting in a straw clamp, and a page on which of the spring seeps stayed running in a dry August, and a page on doctoring milk fever, and a page near the middle about goats. Ada had grown up hearing the book read aloud at the table on winter nights, and now that she was alone, she read it to herself in the evenings by the lamp, and it was the ledger that had put her hand up at the sale. On the goat page, in Dosia's careful pencil, was the line that had done it. A goat eats up, not down, it said. It went on, in the plain way her mother wrote, that a goat browsed the brush a cow would starve beside, that it fed on the standing, woody stuff a cow could not use, that it would climb to reach what a cow never could, and that when the ice came and sealed the grass, the goat fed where the cow starved. Below that Dosia had written a harder thing, that there would come a winter in a lifetime when the hay ran out and the grass turned to glass, and that in such a winter the goat was the only stock that would feed itself. Ada had read that page 100 times over the years without ever needing it. Now she had 40 goats and a book that told her exactly what to do with them. And what the book told her was the opposite of everything the men at the co-op believed. It did not say pen them. It did not say fence them tight and buy hay. It said keep them on the hill and let them feed. So that was what she meant to do, whatever the road said. The hard frost autumn had already gone over into early winter by the time she had them home, and she settled into the work of it as she settled into everything, quietly and by herself. She did not build the goats a lot. She let them range the brushy ridge behind the house and the cedar breaks that ran down the north slope, the rough ground her husband had always called wasteland, the steep acres too grown up in cedar and sumac and greenbrier and blackberry cane to make a pasture out of. The goats took to it like they had been waiting all their lives for it. They spread out along the ridge each morning and worked the brush all day, rearing up to reach the low cedar, walking the greenbrier down to the cane, peeling the bark off the young sumac in long strips. And they came down at dusk fat and loud and looking for the handful of cracked corn she gave the milkers. Because there were milking does among the 40, 6 of them, heavy-bagged old nannies that somebody had once bred for the pail and then given up on. Ada milked them by lantern in the shed in the black cold of the mornings, her breath and the doe's breath hanging together in the light, and she carried the pail back to the house through frost that crunched under her boots. She named the 6 as anyone names animals handled every day, the old lead doe she called Junie, and a big red one she called Ruby for the color of her, and a rangy black nanny with one white ear she called Sister. She kept the ledger going as her mother had. She penciled in which day she had turned to the broken-horned buck and when, so she would know her kidding dates come spring. She wrote down the day she mended the browse line where the herd had pushed through on to the county road, and the day she doctored the weather that tore himself on the wire, and the weight of the morning milk when it was worth writing. The book filled up slowly in her hand under her mother's older entries, and on the bad evenings it was the only company she wanted. The ledger did more than keep her company through those first weeks. It kept her steady. When the herd pushed a gap in the old fence and drifted up the county road one November morning, and a car had to slow for them, and Ada spent an afternoon apologizing and restapling wire, she went home half of a mind to pen them after all. She took the book down that night and found the line where Dosha had written that a goat pinned off the brush is a goat gone to ruin, that the crowding and the wet and the worms would take more of them than any dog or any weather ever would, and that the hill would keep them cleaner and cheaper than a lot ever could. So Ada did not pen them. She mended the browse line instead, and she read a second page while she had the book open, an old one on making a salt and mineral lick out of what she had on hand, because a browsing goat wanted salt worse than a grazing cow did, and she mixed it as the page told her and set it out on the ridge. The men at the co-op would not have believed how much of what she did that winter came out of a soft-cornered book on a kitchen shelf. The road did not stop. All that early winter the co-op chorus kept at her, and it got easier for them because the goats gave them so much to work with. The goats climbed. They stood on the woodpile, on the low shed roof, and one memorable Sunday on the hood and cab of Ada's own parked truck, 4 of them at once, surveying the valley like they owned it, and word of that got around the county before the week was out. A man could not pass her mailbox without a joke ready. Delbert Hooks told it all winter that the widow's goats had learned to drive. Then Burl Tarrant came. Burl ran the biggest cattle operation in the township, 100 head of good white-faced cattle on the best bottom ground in the valley, and he liked to be seen being generous as some men like to be seen in a new hat. He came by in his good truck on a bright cold afternoon and brought 2 of his hands along to hear him do it, and he offered, standing in her yard with his thumbs in his belt, to take the useless goats off her hands so she would not have to feed them through the winter. He said it kindly, which was worse. He said a woman alone had no business trying to make anything out of 40 brush goats on a rock ridge, that it was no shame, that hill ground like hers had never carried anything and never would, and that he would haul the whole string off that very afternoon and call it a neighborly favor. Ada thanked him and said no. Burl looked at her a moment, as the auctioneer had, then shook his head and drove off. And by supper the whole road knew that the widow Renfro had turned down a favor from Burl Tarrant to keep a hillside of weed-eaters. Then the weather turned mild, and mild was the cruelest thing it could have done. A warm, wet spell settled over the hills through the middle of the month, the ground going soft and greasy, the creeks running high and brown, the frost gone out of the mornings, and every warning of a hard winter that Ada had built her whole plan around began to look like an old woman's foolishness. The mockers looked right. If the winter was going to come in soft and stay soft, then she had bought 40 climbing nuisances for nothing, and there was no ice coming to prove her mother's book true. Only mud and jokes and a long spring of kidding out goats she could not sell. There were nights in that wet spell when Ada doubted all of it herself. She would stand at the window with the lamp behind her and watch the warm rain come down out of a soft gray sky and think that her mother had written the goat page in a different world, an older and harder one, and that a woman of nearly 60 had no business betting a widow's small savings and the last of her good name on a line of pencil 20 years cold. She took her husband's old brass barometer down off the wall and tapped it as he used to, and the needle sat there low and would not tell her anything. But the hill people had a saying that a green Christmas makes a full graveyard, and the old signs she had grown up reading were bad ones. The wide rings around the moon on the clear nights, and the thick shucks on the fall corn, and how the cattle down the valley had grown their coats early and heavy. So she left the herd on the ridge and let the road laugh. And she waited, because the book had never once been wrong about the hill in all the years she had known it. In the wet, the herd got into worse trouble than ever. 2 of them found their way up the loft stairs of the barn and would not come down for a day and a half. One got onto a neighbor's parked flatbed and dented the cab jumping off it, and the neighbor came over hot about it, and Ada paid for the dent out of the milk money and said nothing, and wrote the cost in the ledger where the milk weights went. Worse than any of it, the county extension agent came out. His name was Emmett Kell, a young man new to the county who took his bulletin seriously and meant to do his job well, and he drove out on the muddy road and stood in her yard with a clipboard and told her, gently and completely sure of himself, that free-ranging goats in the brush country were a nuisance he had fielded complaints about, that they got onto the roads and into other people's fields, and that the sensible thing for a widow to do was to sell the herd while it was worth something and put the money toward hay vouchers and a few good bread ewes. He wrote a note about it in his file. He was not unkind. That was the trouble with all of them, that they were sure and they were gentle about being sure, and there is no fighting a thing like that from the outside. The lowest night came near the end of the wet spell. A neighbor's dog got up onto the ridge in the dark and ran the herd along the fence and killed 2 of the kids, the youngest goats, the small late-born ones, and Ada found them in the gray morning at the edge of the cedar with the frost just going out of their coats. She stood over them a long while in the cold and did not say anything to anybody. Then she went down to the house and took the stock trailer keys off the nail by the door and sat in the cab of the truck with them in her hand, because Burl Tarrant would still take the herd, and Emmett Kell would call it good sense, and the whole road would say the goat woman had finally come to her senses. She sat there with the cold coming up through the floorboards until her hands were stiff. Then she put the keys back on the nail, and she took the ledger down off the shelf, and by lamplight she wrote in it instead. She wrote the date and what the dog had done, and the count that was left, 38 now, and then she turned to the goat page and read her mother's harder line again. The one about the winter that comes once in a lifetime, as a person says a thing to herself to keep from doing the thing she will regret. Then she blew out the lamp and went to bed, and in the night, while she slept, the weather changed. It came as rain at first, a cold rain that ticked against the window glass and did not sound like anything at all. But the ground had frozen hard under the greasy mud while the warm spell broke, and the air just above it had dropped below freezing while the rain still fell warm out of the clouds overhead, and every drop that touched the frozen world turned to glass the instant it landed. This is what the hill country calls a silver thaw, and it is the thing the old people feared worse than any depth of snow. By first light the rain had glazed the whole county in a shell of clear ice. Every blade of grass in every pasture stood sheathed and bent double under the weight of it. Every fence wire had swollen into a white rope as thick as a wrist. The road down the valley was a single sheet of it, curb to curb, and the trees along the fence rows hung heavy and shining and wrong. Bowed down under a load they were never built to carry. The rain did not stop. It fell for 3 days. On the 2nd day the cedars began to go, their limbs loading with ice until the green wood could not hold, and all through the nights a body could hear them breaking on the ridges, a cracking and a groaning and a crashing that went on in the dark like something heavy walking through the timber. The power lines came down under the load, and the valley went black and stayed black. The roads glazed over so hard and so smooth that nothing moved on them but a fool or a doctor, and precious few of either, and under all of it sealed away as though it had been poured over in glass, lay the grass, the whole winter's grazing of an entire county, still green enough underneath, still right there, and utterly beyond reach. Every grazing animal in the township woke on the second morning to a world where the food was still there, directly under their feet, and they could not get to it. The cattle stood in the frozen lots and pawed at the ice and cut their pasterns on the broken edges of it and did not break through. The sheep bunched against the fences and would not move. Burl Tarrant's fine white-faced cattle, the pride of the valley, stood head down on the glaze with their backs humped against the rain, and the hay in Burl's barn began to go down faster than he had ever in his life planned to feed it, because there was nothing else in the world to put in front of them. He had wintered 100 head easy on that hay in an ordinary year. Now he was carrying every animal he owned on baled hay alone, with no end of the ice in sight, and a man can watch a hay barn empty as he watches a clock. Up and down the road, the story was the same in every lot. The Pruitt place 2 miles down, a small dairy that milked a dozen cows and sold cream to the same town Ada did, went dry in 4 days when the last of the silage ran out and the cows quit letting down, and the Pruitts had a new baby in the house. The big grazing outfits and the little one-cow families were brought to the same wall at the same time, because ice does not care how many head a man runs, only that every one of them was born to eat down. And in town, the co-op ran dry. The word went around on the first bad day, and the trucks that could still move came in sliding, and by the end of the second day, the co-op had sold the last of its baled hay and the last of its sacked cracked corn, and had nothing left on the floor but salt and a broom, and there was no more to be had at any price, because the mills were iced in too, and nothing was moving on any road in that part of the state. The stock standing in the frozen lots began to go thin and then to go quiet, in a manner that frightens a stockman worse than any amount of bawling, because a quiet cow on ice is a cow that has begun to give up. Burl Tarrant did the arithmetic every man with hay was doing in the dark those nights, and it came out worse each time he ran it. He had put up enough hay to winter his 100 head easy into April, and now he was feeding all of it at once, every bit that 100 cattle could clean up and more, because there was not a blade of anything else in the county for them to touch. By the third day, he was carrying his whole herd on what was left in one barn, and he had begun, without telling anyone, to sort out in his mind which cattle he could save and which he would have to let go if the ice held another week. Down every road men were doing the same cold sorting by lantern light, deciding which animals lived. It is a thing a stockman does not forget, and it is the reason the whole county drove out to a widow's gate the moment the roads would bear a truck. Ada's goats did not falter. She climbed the ridge on the second morning with the ice breaking and sliding under her boots at every step, hauling herself up by the fence wire, sure in her heart that she would find the herd huddled and starving in the cedar like every other animal in the county. Instead, she found them working. They were up on the high ground where the cedar grew thickest, and they were feeding, spread out along the ridge as though nothing at all had happened to the world. The ice had sealed the grass flat to the ground, but it had not sealed the cedar, and it had not sealed the sumac, or the greenbrier canes, or the blackberry, or the bark of the young saplings, or any of the standing woody brush that reached up out of the glaze into the free air where a goat could get at it. The whole herd was strung along the ridge on their hind legs, necks stretched up, stripping the green-black cedar and the bark and the woody twigs that stood clear above the ice feeding on exactly the one kind of food the storm had left untouched in that entire frozen county. They were fat. They were noisy. The broken, horned buck was up on a leaning cedar working the top of it, and old Junie had her 4 feet braced high on a sapling and was walking it down to reach the green, and 2 of the kids born the summer before were up on their hind legs, a sight she had never gotten used to seeing, dancing at the low limbs. The bred does were carrying well, and the 6 milkers were still filling the pail every morning and standing there on the ridge in that, ruined, blazing. Silent country where every other animal for miles was going slowly down, Ada put her hand on the fence wire and understood that her mother had been right about the winter that comes once in a lifetime, and that it had come, and that the herd nobody would buy was the only stock in the township that had not missed a single meal. By the time the rain finally quit and the thaw began to work at the edges of the ice, the road had heard about it, and they came to her gate as she had never once let herself imagine they would. They came picking their way down the still glazed road on foot and in trucks that slid sideways at every rise, and they came for what she had. They came first for milk, because there were babies and old people down that road and the co-op was empty and every dairy in the valley had gone dry when the feed ran out, and 86 does were still giving morning and night. Then they came for bread does, because a man who has stood 3 days and watched his cattle go down thin on the ice does some hard and permanent thinking about what an animal ought to be able to eat, and about what he would want on his own place the next time the grass turned to glass. And some of them came just to see it, to stand at the fence with their hands in their pockets and look up at the ridge where the fat goats were still working the cedar above the glaze, and to understand at last what the widow had been doing all winter. They came, and this was the part the road remembered, in the order of how loud they had been. Delbert Hooks came, who had led the laughing in the sail ring back in December, and he came hat in hand for a start of bread does and could not quite meet her eye while he asked. The neighbor whose flatbed the goat had dented came for milk for his grandchildren and paid without a word about the dent. The Pruitts came, the young couple from the little dry dairy, the wife carrying the new baby wrapped against the cold, and Ada filled their cans herself from the morning pail and would not take a cent for it. When the young husband tried to press the coins on her, she folded his hand, shut over them. "Send your boy up every morning," she said, "as long as your cows are dry. A baby needs milk worse than I need a quarter." And on the 3rd morning Burl Tarrant himself came down the icy road in the good truck that had carried him out to offer his favor, come now to buy back milk for the hired hands he could no longer feed properly, and to look, though he would not have said so aloud to anyone, at a hillside of the very animals he had offered to haul away for nothing. He stood at the gate a while with his hat in his hand before he could bring himself to speak. "I made you an offer back in the fall," he said at last. "Told you a woman alone had no business with brush goats on a rock ridge." "You did," Ada said. "You were kind about it. I've fed my whole winter's hay in 12 days, and I'll lose cattle yet before the grass comes back. You didn't lose a one." He looked up at the ridge where the does were stripping cedar up in the clear air. "How did you know?" "I didn't know," Ada said. "My mother knew. She wrote it down, and I believed her. She told him the milk was the same price it had always been, and that he could send a man up of a morning for it like anybody else on the road." Burl put his hat back on. "This county's going to remember the winter a long time," he said. "It'll remember you kept your head when the rest of us lost ours. There is a picture of that morning that the road carried home, and did not forget. The rain had quit in the night, and the sky had come clear and hard and blue behind the storm, and the low winter sun had climbed up over the ridge and set the whole iced over world to blazing, every twig and every wire and every bent blade of grass burning white with light, so that the ridge behind the house looked strung end to end with glass. And Ada Renfro stood in her own yard in that light, with one of her goats gathered up warm against the front of her canvas coat, a big glossy fat doe with her breath steaming in the cold, and the full milk pail sitting in the frozen grass at her boot, and she was not looking at the men at her gate at all. She was looking down at the doe. Behind her the herd was up on the shining ridge with their necks stretched, feeding on the cedar above the ice as easy as any other morning. And across the sagging, ice-caked fence line, in the next pasture over, Burl Terrence's white-faced cattle stood head down and beaten on the sealed grass they could not reach. And 2 or 3 of the men who had laughed at her back in December stood at her gate caught between the one thing and the other, one of them still half grinning out of old habit, and one of them with the grin gone off his face entirely as he looked from the starving cattle to the fat, climbing, milking herd and understood, in one hard second, everything. The one whose grin had gone set it low, almost to himself, so that only the men beside him caught it. She fed hers on what the ice couldn't reach, he said. Nobody had an answer for him. The reason the despised goats beat the ice that starved the cattle was not luck, and it was not a miracle, and Ada would have been the first to tell anyone who asked that it had been written down in a book older than she was. A cow is a grazer. A cow is built to eat down, to take the grass off the top of the ground, and when a storm pours a lid of ice over the whole ground, there is simply nothing left in the world that a cow knows how to eat. But a goat is a browser, built the other way around entirely. A goat is made to reach for the woody and the standing and the rough, the cedar and the bark and the bramble and the twig, the very food that grows up above the reach of the ice and that no glaze can ever seal away. That was the whole of it, and it was that simple. An ice storm can lock every pasture in a county flat under glass, but it cannot lock a goat's table, because a goat's table stands up in the free air, and a goat could do more than only reach it. A goat would climb to browse what a cow could not touch, and would take the coarse, poor, fibrous stuff a cow would starve rather than eat and turn it into milk in the pail. So that Ada Six does went on giving all through the freeze on rough winter browse that would not have kept a steer alive a week. A field of hay can burn. A crib of corn can run out. A co-op can sell its last bale of hay by noon of the second day and have nothing on the floor for the man who comes at 1 o'clock but salt and a broom. But a hillside of cedar and greenbrier cannot sell out, and it does not run low, and it stands up out of the ice in the one winter of a lifetime when the grass turns to glass and every grazing animal in the county is standing hungry on top of its own buried dinner. That was what Dosha had known, and had written down for whoever came after. And it was what her daughter had believed enough to bid $15 on in front of a laughing crowd. Ada never gouged a soul that winter, and she never once stood at her own gate and said that she had told them so. She could have named any price she pleased for milk and for bread does, with the whole road at her fence and no other stock left standing in the township, and she did not do it. She sold the milk for exactly what milk had always cost, And when Delbert Hooks came down the road to her fence, the same man who had said the loudest back in the sale ring that you could not give the things away, Ada did not turn him off, and she did not make him small. She caught up a pair of good-bred does out of the herd, the beginning of a herd of his own, and she put the lead ropes into his hands. Delbert stood holding the ropes and would not look up from them. In the ring that day I said nobody would pay a nickel for them, he said. I know what I said. Ada, I remember it, Ada said. Everybody on this road remembers it. I'd take it back if a man could. You don't have to take it back, she said. You just have to keep these two off the hay and on the brush and write down when they kid. And then she went into the house and brought out her mother's ledger, worn and soft-cornered, and she opened it to the goat page and turned it around and held it out and let him read the whole of it for himself, so that he would understand it was not the widow's cleverness he had come to thank, but her mother's knowing, a thing written down long before either of them, and so that he would carry it away and keep it and not have to learn it the hard way twice. Emmett Kell came back too, the young agent who had stood in her yard in the mud with a clipboard and told her to sell. He did not come with a clipboard this time. He had spent the whole storm going up and down the county roads, counting its losses, the cattle down, the sheep lost under the fences, the hay barns emptied, the dairies dry. And somewhere in there he had counted Ada Renfro's losses too, which came to almost nothing at all. 2 kids to a dog before the ice ever fell. He was an honest enough young man to know exactly what that meant, and to be ashamed of the note in his file. He stood at her fence a long while before he got it out. I wrote in my file that you ought to sell, he told her. I'd like to write something truer this spring, if you'll let me put your mother's name to it. That spring he wrote the brush-browsing goat into the county extension bulletin as a documented, low-cost insurance for the ice country, a hardy animal that fed itself off the standing brush in the one winter when hay could not be bought at any price, and he wrote it plainly. And he named his sources honestly. He set down the name of Dokia, the woman who had kept the hill place, and written the knowing down so it would not be lost, and under it her daughter, who had proved it out in the worst ice storm anyone then living could remember. And when it was all over, when the thaw had finally come and taken the ice off the world in a week of dripping and running water, and the road had gone quiet again, and the herd was back to working the ridge in the ordinary way, Ada took the ledger down one last evening and carried it to the shelf by the kitchen window in the soft lamplight. Before she closed it, she took up her pencil, and beneath her mother's oldest entry on the goat page, the one she had read 100 times over the years, she wrote a line of her own in the plain hand her mother had taught her. She wrote down the winter of 1968 and the silver thaw and the 40 scrubby goats bought for $15 in front of a laughing ring, and how the herd had fed above the ice on the ridge when the whole road below it went hungry. Then she closed the book, and she set it back on the shelf where it had always lived, spine out, in reach where the next person to keep the hill place would find it, and open it, and read it, and know.